You've been lied to about one of the most famous landmarks in the world. What they don't tell you in history class is that this entire structure exists because of a myth that never actually happened. And the truth? It's way more interesting than the story you think you know. So here's the thing. We all grow up learning about these massive monuments and landmarks that define entire cities, right? The Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty, Big Ben. But what if I told you that one of these iconic structures was built on a foundation of complete fiction? I'm talking about a story that historians pushed for decades, that tourists still believe today, and that literally shaped the physical landscape of a major city. And when you find out what really happened, you're going to look at this place completely differently. Today we're diving into the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Yeah, that tower. The one that leans. The one where millions of people take those silly photos pretending to hold it up. But forget everything you think you know about why this tower is famous. Because the story you've heard your entire life? Total myth. And the real reason this tower became legendary is actually connected to one of the biggest scientific lies ever told. Okay, so let me ask you something. Why do you think the Leaning Tower of Pisa is famous? If you said because it leans, you're only half right. Sure, the tilt is what makes it visually unique. But thousands of buildings around the world have structural problems. Most of them don't become global landmarks. So what made this particular Leaning Tower so special that it became one of the most recognizable structures on Earth? The answer you've probably heard goes something like this. Back in the late 1500s, there was this genius scientist named Galileo Galilei. He was born in Pisa and he had this revolutionary idea about gravity and falling objects. At the time, everyone believed that heavier objects fell faster than lighter ones. This was based on what Aristotle had taught, and nobody questioned Aristotle because, well, he was Aristotle. But Galileo thought differently. And according to the famous story, he decided to prove everyone wrong by climbing to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He brought two cannonballs with him, one heavy and one light. Then, in front of a crowd of students and professors, he dropped both balls at the exact same time. And guess what? They hit the ground at the same moment. Mind blown. Science changed forever. The tower became legendary as the birthplace of modern physics. It's a great story. It's dramatic. It's visual. It's the perfect underdog tale of one smart guy proving the establishment wrong. There's just one tiny problem with this story. It never happened, not even close. Let me break down why this myth is so ridiculous, and then we'll get into the real story, which is honestly way more fascinating. First off, there's zero evidence that Galileo ever performed this experiment at the tower. None. We have tons of Galileo's writings, his notes, his letters, his published works. The guy documented everything. And nowhere, not once, does he mention dropping anything off the Leaning Tower of Pisa. In fact, Galileo himself wrote about thought experiments involving falling objects, but he specifically described them as theoretical exercises, not actual demonstrations. The first time this tower story appears is in a biography written by Vincenzo Viviani, who was Galileo's student. But here's the kicker. Viviani wrote this biography in 1654, 12 years after Galileo died. And Viviani had a motivation to make his teacher look as legendary as possible. He was trying to secure Galileo's place in history, and also probably trying to make himself look good by association. So he added this dramatic tower scene to spice things up. But even if we ignore the fact that Galileo never mentioned it himself, the story doesn't make practical sense. Think about it. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is about 56 meters tall. That's roughly 183 feet. Now, try to imagine dropping two cannonballs from that height and having a crowd of people on the ground accurately judge which one hit first. From that distance, with the naked eye, dealing with wind resistance and the speed of falling objects, it would be almost impossible to tell. The difference in landing time would be fractions of a second. You'd need slow-motion cameras to really see it clearly. Plus, the experiment wouldn't even work the way the myth describes. In real life, if you drop two objects of significantly different weights from a tower, the heavier one usually does hit first, but not because of gravity. It's because of air resistance. A lighter object with more surface area relative to its weight gets slowed down more by the air. So unless Galileo's cannonballs were perfectly spherical and made of the same material, just different sizes, the demonstration would actually seem to prove Aristotle right, not Galileo. So if Galileo didn't do this experiment, where did he actually get his ideas about falling objects? Well, he did conduct experiments, just not the dramatic public ones. Galileo used inclined planes. Basically, he rolled balls down ramps at different angles and timed them carefully. This allowed him to slow down the motion enough to take accurate measurements with the primitive clocks available at the time. He could change the angle of the ramp, use different-sized balls, and record everything systematically. It wasn't as flashy as dropping cannonballs off a tower, but it was actual science. The inclined plane experiments led Galileo to conclude that in the absence of air resistance, all objects fall at the same rate regardless of their mass. This was revolutionary because it contradicted Aristotle, who had said that a 10-pound weight falls 10 times faster than a 1-pound weight. Galileo proved that gravity accelerates all objects equally, and that what we see as different falling speeds in everyday life is actually caused by air resistance, not by the object's weights. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Even though the tower experiment never happened, the myth became so powerful that it actually changed how people viewed the tower itself. Before the Galileo story became popular, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was just a weird architectural mistake. It was the bell tower for the cathedral, and it started leaning during construction because the ground underneath was too soft. They tried to fix it multiple times over the centuries, but it just kept leaning more and more. Nobody thought this was particularly special. Medieval Italy was full of impressive bell towers. The one in Pisa just happened to be wonky. If anything, it was kind of embarrassing. Like, imagine building a tower and it immediately starts falling over. Not exactly the flex you're going for. But once the Galileo myth took hold in the 1800s and 1900s, suddenly this leaning tower wasn't just a construction failure. It was a monument to scientific progress. It was the place where one man stood up against centuries of false teaching and proved the truth through direct observation. It became a symbol of the Enlightenment, of questioning authority, of the power of the scientific method. Tourism exploded. People started traveling to Pisa specifically to see the tower where Galileo supposedly made his great discovery. The city leaned into this, no pun intended. They marketed the tower as a historic site of scientific importance. Postcards showed illustrations of Galileo at the top, cannonballs in hand. Textbooks repeated the story as fact. And even today, if you take a tour of Pisa, many guides will still tell you some version of the Galileo experiment, even though historians have debunked it for decades. So this myth literally transformed a random leaning building into one of the most visited landmarks in the world. The power of a good story, right? But let's dig deeper into why this myth was so appealing that it overshadowed the truth. In the 1800s, there was this growing tension between science and religion, especially in Italy. Galileo had been tried by the Catholic Church for supporting heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun rather than the other way around. He spent the end of his life under house arrest. So by the 1800s, Galileo had become this martyr figure for scientific freedom. People wanted stories that showed Galileo as a bold rebel who challenged the establishment. The tower experiment fit perfectly into that narrative. It had visual drama, it was easy to understand, and it made Aristotle and the old guard look foolish. Never mind that Aristotle had been dead for like 2,000 years by the time Galileo came around, and nobody was actually still defending Aristotle's views on physics by the late 1500s. The myth needed a villain, so Aristotle and his followers got cast in that role. What's really wild is that other scientists before Galileo had already questioned Aristotle's ideas about falling objects. A Flemish mathematician named Simon Stevenus wrote about dropping 2 lead balls of different weights from a tower in the 1580s, before Galileo's supposed experiment. And even earlier in the 6th century, a Byzantine philosopher named John Philoponus had criticized Aristotle's physics and suggested that falling speed wasn't determined by weight alone. But none of those guys got a famous landmark named after their experiment. Galileo got the tower even though he didn't actually use it, because the mythmakers in the 1800s decided he was the hero their story needed. Now here's the moment that really shows the power of this myth. In the 1900s, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was in serious danger of collapsing. The lean had gotten so extreme that engineers were worried the whole thing would topple over. So they launched this massive project to stabilize it. They had to be super careful because if they straightened it too much, they'd ruin what made it famous. But if they didn't do enough, it would fall. During the planning stages, there was actually debate about whether they should fix it at all. Some people argued that the tower should be allowed to fall naturally. After all, it's just a building with a structural defect, right? But others argued that it had to be preserved because of its connection to Galileo and the birth of modern science. Think about that for a second. Engineers and politicians were making decisions about spending millions of dollars to save a building, partially because of an event that never even happened. The myth had become so embedded in cultural consciousness that it influenced real-world engineering and historic preservation decisions. They ended up doing the stabilization work in the 1990s and early 2000s. They removed soil from under the high side to let the tower sink back slightly. It worked. The tower is still leaning, but it's stable now. And tourists still come by the millions, many of them believing they're visiting the site of Galileo's famous experiment. Here's what really gets me about this whole thing. The actual story of how Galileo figured out the laws of motion is so much cooler than the myth. This guy spent years carefully designing experiments, building equipment, making measurements, and working through the math. He didn't just climb a tower and drop some stuff and go, aha! He did meticulous, repeated trials. He questioned his own results. He refined his methods. That's what real science looks like. But we don't tell that story because it's not as dramatic. We want the Hollywood version where the genius has a sudden breakthrough in front of a cheering crowd. We want the eureka moment. And so we invent myths like the tower experiment, or the apple falling on Newton's head, or Archimedes jumping out of the bathtub. These stories are satisfying, but they give people a completely wrong idea of how scientific discovery actually works. And in the case of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the myth became so powerful that it literally changed reality. It transformed a building from a curiosity into an international landmark. It shaped tourism, influenced preservation efforts, and became a symbol of scientific progress. All because of a story that a student made up 12 years after his teacher died. So what's the takeaway here? I think there are a few lessons in this story. First, just because something is widely believed doesn't mean it's true. The tower experiment was repeated in textbooks for generations before historians really started questioning it. Always be willing to look deeper and ask for evidence, even for the stories that seem obviously true. Second, myths can have real power. Even though the Galileo experiment never happened, the myth shaped how people viewed the tower, influenced tourism, and probably even helped save the building from collapse. Stories matter, even false ones. They shape our culture and our decisions in ways we don't always recognize. Third, the truth is usually more interesting than the myth if you take time to understand it. Galileo's actual experiments with inclined planes tell us so much more about the scientific process than the tower story ever could. The slow, careful, systematic work of real science might not be as flashy, but it's what actually moves human knowledge forward. And finally, it's worth asking what other myths we're still believing. How many other famous landmarks, historical events, or scientific discoveries have origin stories that are more legend than fact? Probably more than we'd like to admit. Every time you hear a story that seems a little too perfect, a little too dramatic, that wraps everything up with a neat bow, that should be a signal to dig deeper and see what really happened. The Leaning Tower of Pisa stands today as a monument to human ambition, medieval engineering, and the soft soil of the Tuscan plain. It also stands as a reminder that sometimes the stories we tell about places can become more influential than the places themselves. Galileo never dropped those cannonballs, but millions of people believe he did. And that belief changed the world just as much as if he had actually done it. That's the hidden myth behind a modern-day landmark. A story that never happened, believed by almost everyone. Powerful enough to shape reality itself. Makes you wonder what else we've got wrong, doesn't it? Subscribe if you want more history myths exposed.